the bugs send another meteor our way. But this time, we're ready. Planetary defenses are better than ever.
Ah, the moon. A beautiful, silvery orb that lights up our nights. But to Brianna Wu, a lurking omen of doom. When Wired presented breaking news that SpaceX was planning to launch a privately crewed mission to the moon next year, Brianna Wu reacted strangely, saying that this is being covered as a fun hijink for rich people, but the idea of private corporations having access to the moon should give us pause. She went on to say that the moon is probably the most tactically valuable military ground for Earth, rocks dropped from there having the power of hundreds of nuclear bombs. People reacted, perhaps not unsurprisingly, with scorn and derision. Yet the fact is that this is probably, and I admit this isn't a particularly high bar to set, but this is probably one of the least delusional things that Brianna Wu has ever said, even though she's clearly read The Moon is a Harsh Mistress one too many times. But it's a good book, so who can blame her? It is indeed concerning, or should be concerning to many of us, that space, which was once only accessible to governments in one way or another accountable to their people, now it's increasingly accessible to private corporations. And private corporations are in it for the money. Not for the knowledge, not for the exploration, not for anything else, but the money. Now, there's no biosphere on the moon for us to worry about being destroyed. But the moon is our jumping off point to the rest of the solar system, and even perhaps one day further afield. So we should be concerned if it falls into private hands and the resources that humanity as a whole may need may end up being claimed by private interests. Wu's concerns are, however, startlingly premature and not particularly credible, at least when it comes to the moon. We've had long-standing plans to colonize the moon, to mine the moon and to use its resources. This has only become more viable as our experiments in fusion get better and better, and as the moon becomes a more interesting and viable source of helium-3, which would be used as a fuel for fusion reactions. How do we get material from the moon back to Earth? Well, the idea, the one that seems to terrify Wu, is to use electromagnetic acceleration, otherwise called mass drivers. Now what these do is these use electromagnetism to fling material from the surface of the moon towards Earth. But the idea is not and has never been to strike Earth. Rather, it has been to send material to catcher satellites, which would then return the material to Earth. And we're not talking about giant rocks when we talk about mass drivers. Most of the papers and so on describing how a mass driver would work posit 20 to 30 kilogram parcels at a time of material being shot, and not at particularly high velocity. Now, this isn't to say that railguns don't exist or that they aren't utterly terrifying in their effect. All you have to do really is to take a lump of mass and accelerate it to massively high velocity, and you can indeed do a terrible, terrible amount of damage. But the kind of mass drivers that we would need or want on the moon would be much bigger, firing much bigger projectiles, which has a much higher energy cost, and they would not need to accelerate them to the same degree that these weapons need to. Getting into orbit from the moon is a relatively easy exercise, and you only need to go a little bit faster than that and you can coast all the way into Earth's orbit and to the proposed pickup satellite. So when we're talking about lunar mass drivers for mining, for returning material to the Earth, we're not talking about these kind of mega cannons that the Navy is experimenting with and that others have been experimenting with. We're talking about much less powerful, but much bigger industrial materials. And the kinds of projectiles that they can fire would burn up in the atmosphere anyway. To get through the atmosphere, you need a lot more speed and a lot more mass, and so the energy demand rises exponentially. Railguns really aren't any threat to Earth from the moon. At least, not as they've been proposed so far. Now, much more concerning are asteroids. We can reach those easier than the moon. We can nudge them off course easier and more cheaply than it would be to create a mass driver on the moon, set up all the infrastructure, maintain the moon base, keep astronauts alive and everything. And asteroids have the potential for much more damage. Many of them are already moving at much higher velocities. They're much bigger, much easier to misdirect. These are the things you should be more concerned about. These are the things that can do the serious damage. Now, fortunately, we already have all kinds of space treaties about weaponizing or using weapons in space. But the sheer fact of the matter is that sooner or later we are going to have to start exploiting space resources. We're going to have to start mining asteroids, mining the moon, using the resources that are out there, simply because it's much cheaper to explore the solar system if you use those resources that are already out there. So we're going to have to start taking the risk if we want to become more than a single planet species. And the potential for terrorism and misadventure and other issues, and the sheer devastating impact that these would have, that's definitely cause for concern. So perhaps, rather than reading The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, we should be reading Lucifer's Hammer, which is an excellent book about survival after a comet impact. Or perhaps we should be reading Footfall, which is about aliens using these kind of things as weapons, and really emphasises the importance of holding the high ground in these kind of battles. The real problem with Wu's paranoia, however, is that it really requires Elon Musk to be a supervillain. And I'm not entirely convinced that he is. Now, obviously we have to worry about different people in the future, but Elon Musk, much as I have my issues with PayPal, I'm not really convinced that he is some kind of maniacal space tyrant. Now, space is the last place that we could get a Nemo or a Rover the Conqueror, but I'm just not convinced that he's it, or that he could get away with it, even if he was. It is a good argument to retain government space programs alongside private space programs. Should some corporate individual go rogue or decide to be some sort of supervillain, then we would need to retain some kind of capacity to deal with them, which means that we would need a governmental space program, a military space program of some kind, in order to be ready to deal with them. Still, should we end up with some kind of space tyrant, well, we Brits seem to know how to deal with them, don't we, Roger?
Heartbroken, Mr. Drax. Allow me. Take a giant step for mankind.